You find yourself locked in a stone cell beneath the grandest arena ever built. Just above you, 50,000 Romans watched your husband face a lion in a brutal fight. The crowd is finally dispersing, and the torches flicker dimly. Suddenly, you hear heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, drawing nearer. A shadow looms at your doorway. It's the gladiator who survived the massacre. He's drenched in blood that isn't his own. A guard unlocks your cell, and the gladiator points at you. This isn't a scene from a horror flick. This was just another Tuesday in the Roman Empire. What I'm about to share is a side of Roman history that is rarely discussed in classrooms. It's a chilling state-sponsored nightmare that unfolded after the crowds went home. And this isn't just a theory. It's all documented by Roman writers themselves. The evidence is literally etched into the walls beneath the Colosseum. Stick around until the end, and I promise you'll never view ancient Rome the same way again. Hollywood has been spinning tales about gladiators for decades. Films like Gladiator and Spartacus showed you the bloodshed, the battles, the honor, and the rebellion. But they gloss over what happened in the hours after the games ended, when the spectacle morphed into something far darker. We're talking about a system so disturbing that modern historians had to coin a new Latin term for it. Victoria Carnels, or the carnal victory. The Romans didn't even have a special name for it. To them, it was just the norm. Here's what we know for sure. Roman writers like Martial and Seneca painted a picture of a world where conquered women were stored beneath arenas and handed out as prizes, literally distributed like rations, to gladiators who performed well. The Roman government ran this system with the same bureaucratic precision they used to build aqueducts and roads. Think about that. The same civilization that gifted us concrete and representative government also mastered the industrialization of sexual violence. Before we dive deeper, I need you to do something. Look at that like button right now. If you believe that hidden history deserves to be revealed, even when it's uncomfortable, hit that button and drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from, because this story goes beyond just Rome. It's all about what empires do when no one's watching. So, let's dive into the hype. To really grasp what went down in those underground chambers, we need to understand how Rome turned people into mere inventory. This wasn't just random cruelty. It was a systematic dehumanization on a massive scale. It all kicked off the moment Roman legions took over new lands. When they crushed a rebellion in Gaul or wiped out a city in Judea, they didn't just win a battle. They processed entire populations. It was like a factory assembly line for human suffering men of military age sent off to die in mines or arenas. Kids sold into slavery across the empire, and women treated as war prizes belonging to the state. Now, here's where it gets really chilling. Under Roman law, these people weren't even considered human anymore. They were classified as property, just like furniture or livestock. A conquered woman had no more rights than a chair. You could do anything to her. And it wasn't even a crime, because you can commit a crime against an object. But Rome didn't stop at dehumanizing folks through law. They did it through spectacle, too. The games weren't just for entertainment. They were political theater meant to dominate both the conquered and Rome's own citizens. When you watched a captured Germanic chieftain fight a lion, you weren't just seeing a man die. You were witnessing a brutal message about what happens to anyone who defies the empire. And during the midday break, when the elite headed off for lunch, that's when things turned truly sadistic. Historians call these fatal charades mythological reenactments, where condemned prisoners acted out famous myths, but the deaths were real. The poet Martial, writing in the 1st century AD, describes these scenes with a disturbing casualness, almost like reviewing a restaurant. He writes about a prisoner dressed as Orpheus, the legendary musician who could charm any creature with his song. They led him into the arena with a lyre, released a bear. Martial notes, almost disappointed that this time the music didn't work, as the bear mauled the man to death, while 50,000 people ate honeyed dates. In another passage, and I'm warning you, this is deeply disturbing, Martial describes a woman forced to reenact the myth of Pasiphae, who mated with a sacred bull. For this prisoner, it meant being publicly assaulted by an animal in front of thousands of spectators until she died from her injuries. Read that again. The Roman state designed a system where human beings were raped to death by animals as lunchtime entertainment. This wasn't the sick fantasy of one mad emperor. This was decades of standard operating procedure. Senators brought their children to watch. The events were advertised on walls throughout the city. Vendors sold snacks. Marshall himself notes that whatever myth tells us, the arena makes real. But here's the thing that should terrify you. He's writing this as a compliment. He's praising the efficiency of the system. This was the environment. This industrialized bureaucratic machinery of cruelty that also processed conquered women into the reward system for gladiators. Now, let's talk about the men who received these rewards. Gladiators existed in a bizarre contradiction that Rome never fully resolved. They were simultaneously the lowest and highest members of society, slaves with less legal status than a dog, but celebrities whose faces appeared on mosaics and whose names were graffitied on walls by adoring fans. Women of the aristocracy were obsessed with them. Ancient graffiti from Pompeii calls one gladiator the sigh of the girls and another the glory of the ladies. There are documented cases of noble women sneaking into gladiator barracks, paying off guards for private encounters. The gladiator Sergius apparently had affairs with multiple married patrician women, causing enormous scandals. Even stranger, their bodily fluids were commodified. Gladiator sweat was collected after fights, mixed with olive oil, and sold as an aphrodisiac and beauty treatment. Can you imagine that level of celebrity worship? These were enslaved men, and their sweat was bottled and marketed to the wealthy. Yet, Rome lived in constant fear of these gladiators. The Spartacus rebellion in 73 BC is a prime example. 78 gladiators escaped, rallied an army of 70,000, and nearly toppled Rome. For 2 years, they embarrassed the Roman legions. When Rome finally crushed them, they crucified 6,000 survivors along the Appian Way, one body every 40 meters for 200 kilometers. That's a haunting image, right? A forest of crosses stretching from Rome to Capua. That trauma never left the Roman mindset. Every time a gladiator picked up a sword, every lanista running a gladiator school, every spectator in the stands remembered that these men had come alarmingly close to burning Rome to the ground. So, how do you control these incredibly dangerous, yet valuable men who have real grievances and the skills to act on them? It's all about a mix of brutal punishment and calculated rewards. Extra food, prize money, and even freedom after enough victories were part of the deal. But there's something deeper hinted at in the sources Saxus. 2. Conquered women. The documentation is frustratingly scattered. Roman writers mention it like it's too obvious to explain in detail. But if you piece together references from Martial, Juvenal, and later sources, a pattern starts to emerge. After a standout victory, especially during major games funded by the emperor or wealthy senators, gladiators who fought well were granted what ancient texts vaguely call privileges of the victor. Modern historians, reading between the lines and cross-referencing what we know about military rewards and slave management, believe this often meant access to female captives held beneath the arena. The process was chillingly bureaucratic. The gladiator would be taken down into the hypogeum, the vast underground network beneath the arena floor. Still in his armor, still covered in blood and sand, he'd be escorted by a ludus officio or arena administrator. They'd walk through dimly lit tunnels, past animal cages and mechanical lifts, until they reached specific holding cells. These weren't your average prison cells. Archaeological digs in various amphitheaters like Capua, Pompeii, and even beneath the Colosseum reveal small chambers with unique features. Think stone, benches, iron rings anchored into the walls, and doors that locked from the outside. Some rooms even show evidence of chains permanently attached to the architecture. The women held in these cells were called captivi, war captives who had already been processed through Rome's bureaucracy of conquest. Their names were recorded by officials called commentari, who tracked state property. Each woman was assigned a number and categorized based on her origin: Germanica, Britannica, Partica. The gladiator would be shown a row of cells. Some accounts suggest he could choose which woman he wanted. Others imply they were simply assigned, like checking out equipment from a warehouse. Either way, a guard would unlock the designated cell. The woman would be brought out, or the gladiator would enter, and the door would be locked again. What happened next isn't detailed in surviving sources, but you don't need much imagination to fill in the gaps. The architecture tells a story that the texts don't. Here's the really chilling part. This wasn't a crime. Most Romans didn't even see it as morally questionable. This was just part of the operational budget of the games. The logistics of what they called Victoria Carnalis were handled by the same folks who scheduled animal fights and maintained arena equipment. From the state's perspective, this system neatly solved multiple problems. It's a dark chapter in history, but it gives you a glimpse into how power and control worked in ancient Rome. Loyal gladiators got cheap rewards, right? Conquered women didn't cost the state a dime since they were just seen as spoils of war. This setup gave gladiators a sense of power and privilege, but it didn't actually grant them any real freedom or authority. It sent a clear message to both the gladiators and the conquered. This is what Roman dominance looks like. Winning in the arena gives you the same kind of absolute power the emperor has over the defeated. One Roman writer, whose name is lost to time but whose words have been quoted by later historians, put it simply, the victor claims their prize, just like the empire claims its provinces through conquest. Now, let's dive into the physical spaces where all this went down, because the archaeology tells a pretty grim story. When archaeologists first dug beneath the Colosseum in the 19th century, they were mainly focused on the impressive engineering, like the elevator systems that lifted animals to the arena and the complex tunnels for moving people and equipment. But as they kept digging, they stumbled upon something unexpected: specialized chambers that didn't seem to serve any obvious purpose. These small rooms, usually about 10 to 15 square meters, are tucked away in a separate section of the hypogeum, far from the animal cages and gladiator prep areas. What makes modern archaeologists uneasy are the distinctive features of these chambers. Stone benches line the walls, but unlike those in other areas, these are built at specific heights. There are iron rings anchored into the walls at different levels, some at floor level, some at waist height, and others even higher. The doors are heavy wood reinforced with iron, and they lock from the outside. Several walls show signs of scratching, as if desperate fingernails tried to dig through solid stone. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century, mentioned that beneath major amphitheaters were chambers for those waiting for their turn. His wording is a bit vague, but he's discussing the logistics of the games, especially how they managed human resources. The most disturbing evidence comes from graffiti found in the hypogeum beneath the amphitheater in Capua, the same city where Spartacus started his rebellion. Archaeologists discovered scratch marks on cell walls, some in Latin and others in various languages from across the empire. Most of these inscriptions are fragmentary, but a few are clear. One, written in rough Latin by someone who clearly wasn't a native speaker, translates to "I was Aemilia of Tobogantis. I saw my children killed. Now I am nothing." Another, seemingly in Celtic, says, "To any god who listens, let me die before tomorrow." These aren't the voices history usually remembers. Roman records focus on emperors, generals, military victories, and grand buildings. They don't bother with the names of conquered women treated as property. But the stones, you remember. The architecture itself tells us something really important. This system was all about efficiency and repetition. These weren't just random spots for assaults. They were purpose-built, well-maintained facilities designed for what went down inside them. When you compare this to how Rome managed other gladiatorial aspects, the pattern becomes pretty clear. Gladiator barracks, animal facilities, weapon storage. Of every part of the arena setup was carefully planned and standardized throughout the empire. The captive chambers fit right into this pattern. This was state-sponsored infrastructure for systematic abuse. Some historians say we shouldn't read too much into these chambers, arguing they might have been used for different purposes, and that we're reprojecting our modern worries onto unclear evidence. But when you look at the architecture alongside literary references, the Roman military culture, and basic logic about how the system worked, the picture gets painfully clear. Now, let's tackle the hardest part of this story: what this meant for the women caught in this system. History is mostly silent about their individual experiences. We don't have diaries or testimonies. What we have are ledgers listing them as numbers and property inventories, describing them like livestock. Picture this. Female Germanic, approximately 20 years, good health, assigned to Colosseum holding. But we can piece together the nightmare from what we know about the conquest process. These women weren't just random prisoners. They came from specific backgrounds of absolute trauma. When Rome conquered a region that resisted, like during the Dacian Wars or the suppression of the Boudicalid revolt, the aftermath was all about methodical Roman military procedure. After the final battle, the civilian population was processed. Men of fighting age were killed or enslaved for hard labor. Kids under a certain age were separated and sold off to slave markets in the East, never to see their homeland or families again. Women of childbearing age were labeled as captive and shipped in chains to holding facilities. For a woman in this situation, the journey to the arena was already a descent through multiple circles of hell. You'd watched your village burn and seen your children ripped from your arms, screaming. You'd been chained to dozens of other women and marched hundreds of miles to Rome. You'd been stripped, examined like livestock, assigned a number, and locked in a cell beneath the greatest monument to the civilization that destroyed it, everything you knew. The waiting was its own form of torture. You could hear everything. The roar of the crowd above as people you might have known were executed in creative ways for entertainment. The screams of animals being slaughtered. The cheers when a gladiator delivered a particularly skillful killing blow, and you knew you'd never leave. There was no ransom system, no prisoner exchange. Rome didn't negotiate with the conquered. Your people back home, if they even survived, would never know what happened to you. You'd simply disappear into the machinery of empire. Then came the footsteps. The cell door opening, the choice being made, the door closing and locking again with you on the wrong side of it. With a man who just spent the afternoon killing people for entertainment. Roman law provided no protection. You couldn't appeal to magistrates because legally you weren't a person. You couldn't even commit suicide. One of the few escapes Roman culture sometimes viewed with respect. Because if you somehow managed it, you'd be depriving the state of its property, and your body would still be used just differently. This was psychological warfare on a civilizational scale. The humiliation of conquered women wasn't a side effect of Roman military policy. It was a deliberate strategy. The goal was to break the spirit of resistance so thoroughly that future generations would not even dare to think about defying Rome. Ancient sources make this explicit. After crushing the Jewish revolt in 78, the historian Josephus records that Romans deliberately took Jewish women to be distributed among the legions and the games, specifically to demonstrate to survivors that not only had they lost their sovereignty, but they'd lost any ability to protect their families. The message was clear: resist Rome, and this is what happens to your daughters. But occasionally this system broke in unexpected ways. For all its industrialized cruelty, Rome was obsessed with maintaining certain fictions about itself. The empire saw itself as bringing civilization and order to the barbarian world. This self-image required that some horrors remain hidden, which brings us to an event that forced the system into uncomfortable visibility: female gladiators. On extremely rare occasions, women fought in the arena itself. Ancient sources are conflicted about who these women were. Some were clearly slaves forced to fight, but others appear to have been noble women who, in a culture that gave women almost no agency, saw the arena as a perverse form of power and celebrity. The very existence of gladiatrices scandalized Rome's elite. The satirist Juvenal wrote with dripping contempt about aristocratic women who trained with gladiator weapons, writing, "What sense of shame can be found in a woman who wears a helmet?" In 200 AD, Emperor Septimius Sus attended games in Antioch that featured female fighters. According to the historian Cassius Dio, who was present, something unexpected happened. The Greek audience reacted with shock and discomfort, treating the fights with the solemnity they'd give male gladiators. But the Roman spectators, they gerawed, shouted sexual comments, and treated the entire event as an obscene joke. The female fighters weren't seen as warriors. They were seen as a sexual spectacle, accidentally placed in a venue meant for death combat. Sus was reportedly mortified, not by the violence itself, but by how crudely his fellow Romans reacted. The dignity of the games, his propaganda tool, was being undermined by the audience's inability to separate violence from sex when women were involved. So, he banned women from fighting in the arena entirely. Think about what this tells us. The problem wasn't protecting women from violence. Female captivi were still being held in chambers beneath this very arena. The problem was that the violence had become too visible, too public in a way that made Rome's self-image uncomfortable. The emperor was fine with the abuse. He just wanted it to happen in the shadows where it belonged. The abuse didn't stop after Cyrus's ban. It just returned to the darkness of the hypergame where it had always primarily operated. Anyway, here's what should truly disturb you. This system didn't end with some moral awakening. The games continued for centuries. Even after Rome officially converted to Christianity in the 4th century AD, the gladiatorial games persisted for decades. The last recorded gladiatorial combat happened in 404 AD, when a monk named Telemachus jumped into the arena to stop a fight and was torn apart by an outraged crowd. Only then did Emperor Honorius permanently ban gladiatorial combat, but even that didn't end the system of captivity beneath the arenas. The infrastructure remained. The practice of taking war captives remained standard military procedure throughout the Byzantine period. The system eventually faded, not because of moral progress, but because the Roman Empire itself collapsed. The machinery of conquest stopped. So the supply of captives dried up. The institution died from lack of resources, not from ethical evil. Today, when tourists visit the Colosseum, they take selfies in front of magnificent arches and marvel at ancient engineering. Tour guides talk about gladiatorial combat and animal hunts. Most never mention what happened in the chambers below. The stones are still there. Those rings bolted into the walls haven't rusted away. The scratch marks from desperate fingernails are still preserved beneath centuries of dust. The ledgers that recorded human beings as inventory items are stored in Vatican archives and museums across Europe, available to anyone who wants to read them. We're not talking about a few isolated incidents. This was policy. This was infrastructure. This was normal. The Colosseum stands as a monument to what empire actually means. Not just the grand architecture and military victories we celebrate, but the industrialized horror required to maintain absolute power. Every stone in that arena was bought with more than money. It was bought with lives deliberately destroyed in the most systematic ways humans have ever devised. The spectacle on the sand was only the half of it that Rome wanted you to see. The other half happened in those chambers beneath your feet in the moments after the crowd's roar faded into silence. Those voices. The ones that weren't supposed to be preserved, the ones Roman chronosaurs didn't think worth recording, are still there in those walls, if you're willing to listen. And that's the story they don't teach in history class. If this exposed something you've never heard before, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're going to keep uncovering the history they tried to erase. Drop a comment with your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next investigation into the darkest corners of the past.